my name's Damian Blake. I'm the head of school for Deakin's School of Education. And it is a privilege to speak to everyone today at the Summit for Teaching Out of Field, I think. Before I get into it, I might just acknowledge that I'm standing on the Wadawurrung people land, the traditional owners of the land of which Geelong is a part of. And I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are present today. You might be interested to know that an elder told me that the name Geelong is derived from the traditional words for to speak or tongue, in actual fact. And it's interesting that we gather for a summit, and that was something that was actually associated with what used to happen in Geelong for a long time, this notion of gathering to bring minds together to speak to each other. The other angle on that too is that when you look at Corio Bay from either a drone or from looking down from the Burrable Hills, you actually see in the bay Point Henry, which actually looks like a tongue, interestingly, within the bay. So it's within the mouth of the bay. So very, very significant occasion, but important to acknowledge that has been happening here for 30 to 40,000 years before I was standing here. So as I said, I'm privileged to be able to speak to you today, and I'll just, sorry, one second, I'll just move to my next slide. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about the context to start with before I address those two key questions, because I think context is really important, and I know that you will have touched on a couple of these items, but I'm going to talk about it from my perspective in the role that I have at the moment as a head of school for what is a very large school of education. And that, I think, will allow us to get to some of the tensions and the discontinuities, but also some of the notion of thinking out of teaching out of field in terms of the ecosystem in which we need to operate to address some of these challenges. Because in many ways, it's not just a case of stuffing more stuff into initial teacher education programs. And I've only got 3 or 4 slides, because I want to keep it right to the point and make sure we get maximum discussion. But I'll just talk briefly about context to start with, and where I'm coming from my perspective. And I'll go back and forward from these when I move through the questions as well. And unfortunately, my story is not unremarkable. In my second week of teaching, as a beginning teacher 20 years ago in a school, I was employed to teach Year 9 science and Year 10 science. I always give the beginning teachers the Year 9 classes, of course. And then in the second week, I was given the job of teaching VCE chemistry because the VCE chemistry teacher didn't come back from holidays, essentially. So, great, I love a challenge, and this was a challenge. And I had actually trained to teach in chemistry, of course. So I really like that. The fact that we'd lost 2 weeks didn't really help. And I was pretty much thrown in the deep end. And I remember the principal at the time sitting in the back of the classroom, keeping an eye on me to make sure things were okay. But over that time of 20 years in school, I, like many others, 30, 40%, possibly more, have taught out of field on many occasions. And the only area I think I haven't taught is food technology, interestingly. And it's the one I really wanted to teach. Being a chemist and those sorts of things, I would have loved to have a crack at that one. But probably not in the first couple of years of my teaching. But over the period of 20 years, well into my 5th, 6th, 7th year, we started to see in schools in the 90s this significant change that was happening as more young people were starting to what we called stay on in school in those days. And I don't know if many of you remember that period of the 90s. It's not like the 70s. You can remember the 90s in that sense, but we actually saw in our schools, a new struggle was emerging with schools trying to adapt to young people who were in schools who hadn't been there before. They would have taken different pathways. And from that point of view, in Victoria, we started to look at developing much more opportunities with vocational programs in particular. So the curriculum was changing. And you're thinking, what's this got to do with teaching out of field? Well, it will make sense as we walk through. So at the time, that's when I finished my PhD in looking at, teaching chemistry on the one hand, but also this growing population of young people in our schools who were so-called staying on and taking vocational and applied learning pathways. And by the end, around about the late 90s, 1999, 2000, we see the development in Victoria of something we call the VCAL program. And huge numbers of young people starting to study the VCAL and do VET in schools, and VET delivered in schools, as we call it nowadays. So you probably see where I'm starting to head here. My PhD then led to the development of a new teacher education program at Deakin, which still runs today in its master's form. But it was in essence all about how we prepare teachers, not just to teach in maths and science, which I would say, are those traditional areas that we absolutely know we need more teachers in, but actually recognizing this growing number of young people for whom most of our teachers were not prepared then and are still not prepared now, to teach. And they are hard work in many cases. So 17 years in higher education since I left schools, and a range of things that I've been doing, including working around accreditation, and I've worked both with the VIT and the AITSL around accreditation. So I had a lot to do with initial teacher education in that sense, and currently the head of school for Deakin. But the context of the pandemic at the moment, the last 2 years have been so different. It's incredibly important for us to think about not just the new challenges that have emerged, but in response to that first question, what new opportunities we now have, because we've learned things and done things that we probably couldn't have done without the pandemic. Although the challenges are there, and the challenge to teaching out of field is even greater than it ever was, I think there are definitely new opportunities. So over the last 2 years, I've been working closely, with the other deans of education, the department, VIT, Catholic Independent Schools, AITSL, ASEQA, on a task force, as we have struggled to try and maintain the supply of our graduate teachers. And in doing that, it's interesting that we have done what some have probably recognized. If you're an activity theorist, you probably see it in terms of a potential ongoing change laboratory, actually, because the opportunity for transformation has been happening by seeing the abilities to work across boundaries, not just between schools and universities, but between regulatory authorities, between departments of education, between the different sectors that we work with, the Catholics and independents. So that has produced some amazing opportunities for us in considering out of field. But remember, out of field happens because of an issue of supply of teachers, and supply of teachers in particular areas. So we are at the moment in a severe shortage of teachers in many particular areas, particularly in the secondary areas, as we know. But as I said, we often think about the traditional subject areas, but the challenge is to start to see things differently in terms of those other areas that are less defined, like those vocational pathways as well. So, I mean, that challenge to supply has seen a raft of initiatives that are looking to accelerate initial teacher education to meet those skill shortages. So there's desperate attempts going along across many of our states, and Deakin, we're involved in a number of them, and we do what we can to help supply. But at the same time, we are doing something quite different, and probably not the preferred model to prepare our teachers, prepare our teachers in teaching in each of those areas. And then I just wanted to emphasize the impact of the jobs ready graduates. And you might expect a Dean of Education to say this, but I don't seriously think people have fully recognized the impact of that, because we have opportunities that we can work with, but at the same time, those opportunities are constrained by revenue. And others in the room who work in this space will probably nod their heads, but the notion that we actually have less income to provide for our pre-service teachers now than we had 5 years ago, yet we've got similar numbers coming in, is a huge challenge. It's an absolutely huge challenge. So the opportunities are not just in what we do in initial teacher education, it's in how we rally to influence policy at the national level in particular, I think. So the jobs ready package, I think, still is having impact on us and will continue to do so until we see some changes there. But I just wanted to make a point too about the perfect storm. I mean, for the past 2 years, we've had teachers, not so much in some states, but certainly in Victoria, this has been a huge issue for us, and New South Wales, perhaps to some extent as well. But we've had our pre-service teachers working in remote learning scenarios, so we can actually have them graduate and maintain workforce supply. We've been working with reduced numbers of days, so we don't get these huge backlogs. So you're starting to see why, you know, working across boundaries is really important here in that sense. But, you know, that perfect storm of graduate teachers in 2022 and 2023 who are going into our schools and have very limited face-to-face time. At the same time, we have young people emerging from a pandemic and reappearing in schools with all sorts of new things that are going to challenge our teachers that we haven't even realized yet. There's an even greater risk that we will see probably more teachers dropping out, you know, within the first year or two. So this notion of needing to work out of field and teach out of field, the conditions that created in the first place have to be addressed, I think. So, and then the final point there in Victoria, and I'll talk about Victoria because we are currently in the process of legislation change that is addressing our senior school certificate in particular. 20 years ago, we introduced the VCAL, the Victorian Certificate of Applied Learning, which ran alongside the VCE. In 2023, there will be no VCAL, but there will be VCE vocational pathways. And one of the reasons why, you know, the Firth Review, which was reviewing the VCAL, made the recommendation for integrating the two was because of the lack of qualified teachers within the field to teach, you know, in those applied and vocational areas. So start to stitch these together, and you'll see probably within the next 2 years, without addressing, you know, some of the most significant areas for teaching out of field. Yes, the maths and science. Yes, we need language teachers, and I haven't mentioned language teachers yet because they're another area impacted by the jobs ready package as well. We are going to see the perfect storm come together with potentially fewer teachers staying on, even though we are seeing lots of them come into our schools and faculties of education, and then young people who really need, you know, teachers who understand to teach in those applied ways in particular. So if we get to the questions within that context, and I'll be to the point and punchy here, the three main points here, you know, what opportunities exist? Well, in that context, the first one is we need to seriously recognize the full breadth of teaching out of field. And we have a good understanding of those more traditional areas, the maths and the science. And I say that because I am a maths science teacher, still registered too, by the way. And, you know, if they get rid of me at Deakin, I'll always go back and get a job in schools, and happy to do that. But those traditional areas we have a reasonable understanding about in teaching out of field. But some of those same maths and science teachers are teaching out of field in areas of applied and vocational learning as well. And so from that point of view, even the ones who are teaching in their maths and science field are teaching out of field in other areas within their discipline. So that tends to sort of challenge them, as we know they are challenged, and they tend to be the teachers who are in the earlier years of their profession, you know, the first 2-3 years in that sense. But the other area is in relation to the specialist teaching areas. And when I say specialist, I'm talking about special schools. In Victoria, they talk about them as special schools. And many of our teachers who are teaching in special schools have no preparation at all for teaching. And there's a complete lack of representation of that in most of our pre-service teaching programs. And I know this because I've accredited quite a few. I work with accreditors to go through these. So I see what's inside most of our programs. But it's a real challenge because our special schools who are doing some of that really heavy lifting are working with teachers who are not fully prepared, and those teachers are teaching out of field themselves with a lack of the depth knowledge. So we need to learn more from the lived experience. And I know this is a theme that has been brought up, but what does that look like within the context of an initial teacher education program? Well, we need to hear from the teachers who are grappling with teaching out of field. And this is where we have the double-edged sword of being really good at preparing and I'll pick on math science teachers again, to be math science teachers and develop their identity as math science teachers. But at the same time, it does come as a shock, as we know from the research, when they are asked to teach out of field. So from that point of view, we need to sort of introduce more of the understanding into our pre-service programs through that lived experience. Sorry if the birds are making a noise, they just decided to start singing today. But anyway, and then the opportunity for professional experience. If we think creatively in that space, what if we were to provide our pre-service teachers with an opportunity to shadow teachers who are not within the area, but are possibly in areas that they're most likely to teach in? So that's not introducing another method, but what it is saying is, what about shadowing or doing some things like that in terms of their professional experience placements? And as soon as we talk about professional experience placements, we need to start to think about, the role that the regulators play and the roles that the department plays and our schools as well. And then that third point, the thing that we have learned most to do in the last 2 years is to work across boundaries. And, I see this as one of the greatest outcomes and one of the greatest opportunities from living through the pandemic. We have been able to share resources and networks like we never have done before. Why can't we do that with a strong focus on pre-service teachers and teaching out of field? And I'm talking about universities and providers working with each other and with schools, and in particular, focusing on this capacity to build resilience in our beginning teachers when they are teaching out of field.
2 minutes, Damian.
Thanks, Paul. And that last point there in relation to targeting the work around high-risk communities and rural and regional areas in particular, because they tend to be concentrating the demand for teaching out of field. So, and 2 minutes to sum up this final point. What about the possibility of introducing teaching fellows? And we've seen teaching fellows at the OLTC and those sorts of things, but I'm talking about teaching fellows whose role it is to work across school university boundaries. And those teaching fellows can facilitate some of the initiatives that enable people to teach out of field when they are required to do so, and support them and build their resilience. But at the same time, help them stay and coach them, within the school context and help influence the university. The opportunity for more pre-service teacher courses to be offered to in-service teacher, particularly around our methods of teaching areas. And of course, the need for improved data collection and sharing that data consistently. That's one of the areas that we have been most challenged in the work across the department and so on, but we're working on a common shared data agreement at the moment, which will be strongly focused on supply of teachers, because at the moment it's a bit of a mess, I have to say. And then more investment in opportunities for teachers to develop their discipline knowledge, of course, because it's all right for me. I can teach out of field in the areas related to maths and science and so on. But for people who are so far from their discipline experience, we need something much more consistent and supportive, I think. And then that final one, is helping our school leaders in particular understand, what they can do to, in relation to out of field teaching strategies and so on, and to minimize it, because we need to minimize the work there. So that, in a nutshell, is my thoughts on those two questions and in the context. And I'd just like to say thank you for the opportunity to speak.